Good morning, everyone. Morning. For people standing, there's a few empty seats here in the middle. Otherwise, we also have some new seats set up there. Feel free to get coffee and food as the day goes on. Welcome to a session boldly titled "The Future of the Ocean." I couldn't think of a bigger title than that one here. Thank you for coming out on this January morning. How many of you folks are here because you take vacations in or near the ocean? Raise your hand. How many people do that? Quite a few. How many of you actually like seafood? Oh, yeah, it's even more. Okay. How many of you actually are concerned about climate change and its impacts on the ocean? That's a lot. And how many of you actually realized you just came to the wrong event? All right, stick around. It's to be more exciting than where you thought you're going to be. So welcome. I'm Craig Hansen. I'm the Vice President for Food, Forest, Water, and the Ocean at WRI. Given that title, I don't sleep very much. But I'm really excited to have you all here in the room today. I see a lot of friends here from the NGO community, some folks from the Hill staff, folks from the private sector, folks from embassies, etc. This is really exciting. What we're doing today is a whole series of events we have in support of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. How many of you are familiar or have heard of this high-level panel? Please raise your hand. Okay, great. So I can go through these slides really, really quickly. The high-level panel essentially is a group of distinguished leaders from around the planet, about 14 heads of government, prime ministers, and presidents, dedicated to basically advancing a new agenda for the ocean, one that enables us to protect, produce, and prosper when it comes to the ocean in support of the SDGs and a better future for planet and the people. Here are the heads of government, the 14 countries whose prime minister or president is a member of the high-level panel. We're lucky today to have actually 3 ambassadors here in the room from 3 of those countries who will actually share a few thoughts throughout the course of the day. Today's event is actually co-sponsored by and co-hosted by WRI, as well as 4 countries, the embassies of Mexico, Embassy of Jamaica, Embassy of Norway, and the Embassy of Portugal. So I want to thank them for co-hosting this event today, and you'll hear from some of those today. We're going to cover quite a few agenda items. The high-level panel has these 14 heads of government, but it's supported by several bodies. One is a group of experts. We've pulled together about 70 or 80 of the world's top experts on marine science, economics, and development from around the planet to develop a series of blue papers, a little play on the concept of a white paper, right? That actually helps lay out answer a number of questions around the future of the ocean. And today is the US launch of 2 of those blue papers, one on the future of food from the sea, where we have one of the lead co-authors here to present that. The other one is the expected impacts of climate change in the ocean economy. And you'll hear a brief summary of those 2 papers. We have the executive summaries of them out in the back. The longer versions are available online. This expert group is co-chaired by Jean Lubchenco, whom many of you know, currently at Oregon State University, Mary Pangestu from the University of Indonesia, and Peter Haugen from the Institute of Marine Research in Norway. We also are supported by a group of an advisory network of members from philanthropy, from the private sector, from intergovernmental institutions, from civil society, to provide input and engagement on these issues for the high-level panel, in support of the high-level panel. I actually have 4 panelists today, many of whom participate in this advisory network. The advisory network is co-chaired by Naoko Ishii, the CEO of the JEF, Maria Damanaki, the head of oceans for the Nature Conservancy, and Sanjeev Mehta, who's the chair of Hindustan Lever. So the high-level panel has quite a group of entities and bodies helping to support it and provide input into its processes. And that said, today's event will share with you 2 of the blue papers. There's 16 in total. 2 of them, which are input to the high-level panel. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the high-level panel, but they're input by a group of experts to that panel. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Ambassador Domingo Pezaz Vital from the great nation of Portugal to share a few thoughts. Ambassador, welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. Craig, dear friend, dear colleagues. My first words, of course, couldn't be but to thank the World Resources Institute, not only for inviting me to be here this morning, but for your outstanding contribution for a better future for us all. The Embassy of Portugal is extremely happy to co-host this event together with the Institute and the embassies of Jamaica, Mexico, and Norway. And I am personally very pleased to be here today among all of you to address, but what is even more important, to learn more about what is a crucial topic for the future of us all, the future of the oceans. Let me start in this context by underlining the importance of these two blue papers that are to be launched in Washington today. With one of the largest exclusive economic zones in the world, Portugal is a proud member of the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy. Over the ages, the ocean has shaped the lives of the Portuguese people, and it continues to be a fundamental element of our identity and prosperity. Portugal plays an important role in ocean governance and has been consistently supporting the international efforts to promote a global mobilization for the protection and sustainability of the oceans. This is why, among several initiatives connected to the oceans in which Portugal has been engaged, our Prime Minister, as you just seen, has also joined this high-level panel initiated in good hour by our friends from Norway. Today, I will talk more in detail about the most important ocean event to be held this year, the 2020 UN Ocean Conference. It will take place in the most beautiful capital in the world, Lisbon, between June the 2nd and 6th, perfect season. And it will be co-hosted by Portugal and Kenya. An online site is already available on oceanconference.un.org. As you may know, the first UN Ocean Conference was held in 2017, and together with Singapore, Portugal was then appointed co-facilitator of the intergovernmental negotiations of the declaration, titled Our Ocean, Our Future, Call for Action. That was adopted on that occasion. Kenya and Portugal offered to host a follow-up conference in 2020. Our countries have since joined efforts to make our commitment a reality, and last May, the UN General Assembly unanimously approved a resolution convening the 2020 Ocean Conference in Lisbon. Why this conference? Because we believe that it is necessary to go a step further in what comes to the ocean. If in 2017, the UN Ocean Conference raised awareness to unprecedented levels, now it is the time to make it a transformational moment. Agenda 2030 is just around the corner, and no one can tackle its challenges alone. Half of the targets of SDG 14 mature in 2020. So it is precisely the right moment to take stock of what has been achieved and to see what we still need to do. That is why, as UN Secretary General, my country fellow man, Antonio Guterres, has put it in September, we have to ask all delegations to bring a plan, not, as I'm doing now, a speech. Following the resolution's formal approval, we have started the conference preparatory process together with Kenya and the most relevant UN departments and other major stakeholders. In this context, we are also looking forward to collaborating with the civil society at large, including the philanthropic sector, to generate a broader sense of ownership and to make this ocean conference a true success at all levels. The conference theme will be scaling up ocean action based on science and innovation for the implementation of Goal 14, stocktaking, partnerships, and solutions. It will seek to build on the outcomes of the first conference and at the same time to explore synergies and draw inputs from the work being done in other processes, such as the Our Ocean conferences and this high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, as well as feed into upcoming initiatives. We'll have a follow-up, like the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Let me also underline that, as you may know, a report of the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy, including recommendations, is expected to be presented at the UN conference in Lisbon. All stakeholders in New York, Lisbon, and Nairobi are doing their utmost and working together to make sure that the conference will be a success in an inclusive and outreaching process, ensuring, as I said, active involvement of civil society at large, namely the scientific community, academia, private and financial and corporate sectors, and non-governmental organizations. Among the priorities of the advisory committee will be the identification of tangible results for the conference, ensuring active involvement of all the above, as well as coordination and cooperation between several international initiatives in the ocean domain, and the definition of a strong communication strategy and outreach activities. The conference shall comprehend 8 plenary meetings and 8 interactive dialogues. The latter will be focused on themes that will be considered in detail by the conference preparatory meeting in New York, scheduled for February 2020. Marine pollution, marine and coastal ecosystems, ocean acidification, fisheries, blue economy, and marine technology transfer were among the themes for the first UN Ocean Conference, and most probably, most of them will be under scrutiny again. Not forgetting as well the relevance of addressing the nexus ocean climate change to support ambitious climate action to minimize the adverse effects of climate change in the ocean and to contribute to its protection and conservation. If climate change is the most preeminent challenge of our times, its adverse impacts on the ocean can be enormous in what has to do with sea level rise and its impacts on coastal communities in all areas, starting with my own country, Portugal. From tourism to fisheries, from ports management to human settlements. As a political outcome, it is expected that the conference will adopt a brief, concise, action-oriented declaration. Focus on the science-based and innovative areas of action to support the implementation of SDG 14. For this purpose, the President of the United Nations General Assembly has appointed the 2 co-facilitators, the permanent representatives of Palau and Denmark to the UN in New York, that will also have the responsibility to co-chair the preparatory meeting in February. We are planning several events on the margins of the conference, namely a Sustainable Blue Investment and Innovation Forum, with the aim to foster a stronger connection between the finance and private sectors and the blue economy. We need them to work together. We are looking forward to a strong participation of international financial institutions in the 2020 Ocean Conference to help make it a true success. We are also envisaging the organization of a youth forum to promote involvement and spreading of knowledge on the ocean issues and science among the younger generations and civil society at large. In order to have a truly game-changing conference in Lisbon, focus on tangible and action-oriented results, it is not only crucial to have a strong cooperation among states and the UN constituency, but also to ensure a strong involvement of all major stakeholders. This is why you will understand, I'm sure, that my final words this morning take the shape of an appeal. Come to Lisbon in June and join us in making sure that action is finally taken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Great words there. How many of you are actually planning to be in Lisbon later on this year? Quite a few of you here. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So So wonderful to hear. And it's going to be really an important event here, as we say. It's only every 3 years now that UN actually has its big events on the ocean. So it's a really important and ground changing and event here for this event. So the next up, I actually have to share perspectives here. I have Ambassador Alfredo Miranda Ortiz, who's the Chargé d'Affaires from the Mexican embassy here. Mexico president is also a member of the high-level panel. Here's some perspectives here from Mexico on the high-level panel. Please welcome and give a round of applause for the ambassador.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for this kind invitation. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to represent my country, member of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, HLP, and to co-host this event on the increasing relevance on the ocean issues and advantages, its future, and how each human being should reconsider the relationship with the oceans. The coastal and aquatic ecosystems are the natural resources, are national treasures for any country, and this asseveration is particularly relevant in Mexico's case. Located between two oceans that highly contribute to its megadiversity and to strengthening of its ties with the rest of the world, Mexico has more than 230,000 square kilometers of territorial sea and over 3 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone. That is to say, Mexico marine territory is almost 50% bigger than its mainland, offering an invaluable source of wealth for the national economy and a fundamental part of the regulation of our climate. Hence, we are more than obliged to advocate in favor of sustainable ocean economy and to promote the sustainable use of marine and coastal resources for the benefit of local communities. Mexico has a high responsibility for safeguarding its biological and cultural heritage for future generations. We are proud to be part of the HLP and are committed to invest in nature-based solutions to protect and restore our ecosystems and to increase their resilience to the effects of climate change. My country has been highly active regarding the HLP agenda. We have held meetings with different government sectors, institutions, organizations, and scientists involved with the sustainable development of the ocean. We are also making sure that HLP recommendations and blue paper suggestions are included in planning and budgets. We are recreating the HLP scheme inside the country, designating a national expert group, an advisory network comprised of national institutions and scientists. As co-chairs of HLP Tourism Group, Mexico is committed to find the best solutions since coastal and ocean tourism supports the economy of developing tropics and many small island developing states, the livelihoods of millions of people, and the great potential as a solution for climate change. As announced by Mexican Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard, at the last United Nations General Assembly, Mexico is designing a new project, Sembrando Vida Marina, sowing marine life, with the aim to conserve and restore marine ecosystems and its biodiversity in order to promote healthy and resilient oceans, as well as local communities that support the development of a sustainable economy. Sowing marine life will strengthen mangroves, seagrass, and coral restoration efforts in order to bring back the ecological structure and functionality of this marine ecosystem. This initiative will also widen and strengthen 20,000 square kilometers of fishing refuge zones that protects more than 100 marine species. These zones are to be expanded in at least 100,000 new hectares to help reduce bycatch and protects the natural reproduction process of marine species. Furthermore, Mexico is working on the update of the national policy for oceans and coasts of the Interministerial Commission for the Sustainable Development of Coasts and Seas by including recommendations from the HLP and Blue Papers. In order to promote a sustainable ocean economy in Mexico, other actions and recommendations from the HLP will be implemented in the near future. Also, as part of our commitment with HLP, Mexico is considered to launch one of the HLP Blue Papers soon. I cannot provide any kind of specific details right now. And I don't want to compete with the big announcement made by the ambassador of Portugal. Finally, I would like to underline that as a members of the HLP, Mexico will continue advocating for the adoption of concrete strategies that encourage ocean-based climate action, combat illegal, undeclared, and unregulated fishing, and phase out subsidies for overexploited fisheries. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. Exciting to hear all the progress your country is making, inspired by the HLP process. That's fantastic. That's exactly what the pressure's on for all the others, right? I hope they're watching on the live stream here. The pressure is on here. So now, for some of the details, right? The first paper on the future of food from the sea. I'm pleased to bring up to the stage here Dr. Christopher Costello. He's the professor of environmental and resource economics at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. And I don't know if you noticed, Chris, but the number of hands up for I eat seafood greatly outweighed those that use the ocean for vacation. So a lot of pressure on you to have a really good presentation. So let's give it up for Dr. Costello.
Thanks for the kind introduction. I should take you to all my talks. Ambassadors, thank you so much for your leadership, and WRI for all of your convening action over the last several months. This has been quite a journey for me and my team working on this blue paper. I think you have an appreciation for what these blue papers take, but let me try to give you just a sense. Our team, here we go. Our team was composed of, I think, 26 authors from 13 different countries. And these are not gratuitous authors. These are really substantive contributors to this work. And that's a hard thing to do, to pull people together from all these parts of the world and to contribute in a substantive way. But it was really, in my mind, the most gratifying thing about the whole process. So I wanted to highlight that and thank WRI and the high-level panel for their leadership in helping make that happen. Our charge was to answer the question, what is the future of food from the sea? No small task. I think we are all used to headlines in the newspaper about the demise of the oceans and overfishing and pollution problems and all kinds of problems that plague the ocean. And I think it's easy to come away from those headlines, many of which I think are quite accurate, come away from those headlines thinking, well, of course, a sustainable future ocean will provide less food, not more food than we currently have. So how can the ocean possibly contribute to our goals of zero hunger and other goals about nutrition and so forth? So that was our question. Can the future ocean sustainably provide more food or less food, and what would be required to do so? I think it's clear and widely appreciated that demand for nutritious food is on the rise. That's due to for lots of reasons. There's population growth, there's income growth, and a whole bunch of other reasons that nutritious food demand is going up. And many of the authors of Blue Paper 1 were really focused on the nutrition component. So I want you to, if you're used to thinking of food from the sea as protein on a plate, I want you to, and I actually had to change my understanding of this as well. I want you to switch that thinking. Protein's a big piece of it, but the nutritious element of seafood is another piece of it. There are omega-3 fatty acids and other fatty acids. There are nutrients and vitamins and minerals that are not easily replicated from other food sources. So there's an increase in this demand. you might think, well, we make food now. Of course, the future world will need more food. Let's just scale up how we do things now. And, that's probably possible to do, but there are all kinds of challenges associated with increasing, especially food on land. It's not to say we can't do it in a sustainable way, and our focus was really on food from the sea, but traditional sources of food, and I'll talk more about how it's broken up between land and sea in a minute, but these traditional sources are really fraught with all kinds of problems. Environmental externalities like carbon emissions, land use challenges, water use, other kinds of externalities, pollution. So the question is, can food from the sea sort of fill this gap, this increasing demand or increasing need for nutritious food? Just to paint a picture of where things stand now, currently food from the sea represents about 16% of animal source food around the world. And if you break that out, if you look out into the ocean and say, well, where is that food coming from? Something like 80%, maybe 80 to 85% is coming from wild fisheries. So almost all food from the sea currently comes from wild fisheries. And I think there's a misconception out there that it's about half aquaculture and about half wild fisheries. That's true if you include aquaculture on land, which we did not. We're focused on food from the sea. So if you look just out in the ocean, the breakout is on the right there. And we're going to ask questions about, how will this pie chart on the left change in the future? And how will the graph on the right change in the future? So hopefully in the next 5 minutes, I can answer those questions. I mentioned this earlier, but food from the sea is really uniquely poised to contribute to future food security. It has a low carbon food footprint. It's highly nutritious along the dimensions that I mentioned earlier. I'll try to make the case that it has high production potential, even higher than we've already been able to deliver. And fish are extremely efficient feed converters. They take basically plant life and little critters and turn them into meat that we can eat in a very efficient way, that's much more efficient than most other animals. Okay, so this is our research question. What is the potential to expand economically and environmentally sustainable food from the sea in the future? We're going to focus on 3 sectors: wild fisheries, unfed mariculture. So these are things like mussels and oysters that you might seed out in the ocean, but you don't have to feed. They just naturally feed on things that are floating around in the plankton. And fed mariculture, like this salmon that's hopefully maybe making you hungry right now. So we're going to focus on these 3 sectors, and our approach with Blue Paper 1 was to look at each sector and ask, what might the supply curve look like for sustainable food from that sector? And a supply curve is a curve that tells you, at any given price, so as demand shifts and prices rise or prices fall, how much will be delivered in a sustainable way from each of these 3 sectors. Sounds simple enough, but of course we have to account for all these features and many, many, many others, and I'll kind of give you a sense of how we did this. But we had to account for biological and ecological interactions. We had to account for technological features and, estimates of technological improvements in the future, and of course lots of other economic considerations. And then, so imagine now we've got these supply curves. We want to know how much food from the sea how much the sea can provide in the future. We want to know what the demand in the future will be. If the demand doesn't change, then those supply curves are sort of irrelevant, but we think the demand will shift. So we're going to draw on some future demand estimates to try to give you a sense of how much the future ocean could provide and could change those graphs that I showed a minute ago. All right, here's maybe a new idea for many of the people in the audience. What does a supply curve of food from the sea look like? And I'm going to posit that it typically looks like this weird shaped thing on the left here. So when fisheries or oceans are not well managed, I claim that you can get a supply curve that looks like this. And actually, we have a lot of empirical evidence that supports this. And the weird thing about this curve is that when prices are low and they rise a little bit, people go out and fish harder. They, go out and farm harder in mariculture. And so they make more food. But if it's unregulated and it's not well managed, then eventually what happens is you get a collapse. You turn that corner, and then you're trying harder and harder. You're overfishing in wild fisheries. You're producing mariculture in unsustainable ways, which ultimately in the long run reduces the supply of food. It doesn't increase the supply of food. The danger of a future with higher demand for food in a setting like this is that you end up collapsing ecosystems even more than they are today. So there's a real danger, and I'm going to get to this at the end. And I really appreciate the ambassador's comments about the need for action, not just a speech. And yet we're all sitting here listening to speeches, but we're trying to move towards action. So we want to avoid that red curve, and I'm going to try to talk about how we think that can happen. Imagine a sustainable supply curve that did not allow this kind of collapse to occur. These are well-managed fisheries. This is allowing for expansion of mariculture, but in a sustainable manner. Now, as demand shifts and prices rise, you actually produce more food, not less food. And I'll talk about those dynamics, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end if they arise. Okay, so how do we construct these sustainable supply curves of food from the sea? Remember, we're looking for 3 of them, 1 for each sector. In wild fisheries, that amounted to having to compile an enormous data set from about 1950 until the present of all wild fisheries for which we have data, about 5,000 fisheries in the world. And for each of those fisheries, what we're going to essentially do, and I'm just scratching the surface here and happy to refer you to the details in the report, we're going to try to estimate different ways that those fisheries could be managed, how sustainable are those approaches, and what are the costs of approaching fisheries management in that way. What that does is it allows us to build a supply curve that is essentially the composition of all 5,000 fisheries in the world and what their contribution to global food security could be. So that's how we build the supply curve for wild fisheries. For fed mariculture, so this is stuff like salmon where you've got a pen and you have to actually feed it something, and feed turns out to be the really pivotal question. What are you going to feed these fish? Traditionally, we have fed fish other fish, so we have to go out and catch wild fish and then feed it to salmon and other things in pens. And that's great. I mean, that's kind of okay if it's done in a sustainable way. But wouldn't it be great if there were other feed alternatives? And in fact, now there are lots of new feed alternatives being developed all around the world. Norway's a leader in this, but other countries as well, that is reducing the requirement of wild fish as an input to fed mariculture. And the more that happens, the farther out that supply curve is going to shift, the more you're going to be able to produce for any given price. So what we're going to do is look at about 67,000 patches of ocean where we know things like, temperature of the ocean and dissolved oxygen in that part of the ocean. And that allows us to calculate how productive that patch of ocean would be. So for any price, we can say whether that patch of ocean is worth farming or not. And as the price rises, more places become worth farming. We adhere to very strict guidelines about sustainable expansion of mariculture to ensure that the kind of sustainable dimension of this supply curve. The unfed mariculture, remember oysters, things like that that are filter feeders, similar kind of thing. We're going to look at the same patches and ask whether at any given price they're profitable to farm in a sustainable manner. Okay, so that gives us 3 supply curves, and I'm just showing one sketch of the results here. There are many, many iterations of this model, and we've done lots of robustness checks to test different assumptions and things. But essentially, the black curves here are the supply curves, 1 for each of the 3 sectors. And then I've overlaid 3 different demand curves. The current demand for fish, the blue is our estimate of the future demand based on FAO data. That's in 2050 in each sector. And then the red is what we call an extreme assumption, which would be, if people really shift their diets toward fisheries and you get population growth, and you get income growth, we might see a demand curve that looks like the red curve. And this gives us a way to estimate what contribution food from the sea could make to global food security in the future. And I'm going to try to summarize that here, and then I'll conclude. So what you see on the right are 4 different figures. Each figure represents a different demand scenario. So the first figure, the first top left figure, is the current situation, which shows that food from the sea represents about 62 million metric tons of animal sourced protein or food, and is composed mostly from wild fisheries. That's the 83 number, and it's somewhere between 80 and 85, depending on the statistics you look at. So a small slice is from the mariculture sectors. Let me focus your attention on the bottom 2 figures. So those show the increase in food from the sea. And remember that I set out to answer the question, could it actually go up? Our answer is yes. In a sustainable way, we think food from the sea can go up in all 3 sectors. I'll talk in the next slide, which will be my last slide, about how to do this. We think all 3 sectors can increase production. And the total goes from 62 up to about 90 under that intermediate demand scenario, and up to about 117 in the high demand scenario. That's the first result, is that total food from the sea we think can increase in a sustainable way. The composition also changes. For example, if you look at the bottom right figure, you see that the composition from wild fisheries goes from 83% down to 53%. So while it's increasing, it's not increasing proportionally as much as mariculture. So essentially, the bottom line is we expect a dramatic expansion from the mariculture sector over the coming decades, as long, in a sustainable way, as long as all of the assumptions are adhered to. The final point I want to make here is that much, much larger, this is a big increase. This is a huge amount of food that we could secure if we were to take strong steps toward a sustainable future for our oceans. So that's a huge amount of food. But I want to emphasize that much larger increases are technically possible. So those supply curves suggest that, in fact, we could produce even a lot more, mostly from mariculture, but that would require big shifts in demand. So if those shifts materialize in demand, the supply will be there from mariculture. Okay, my final slide. So these are kind of action opportunities, getting to the ambassador from Portugal's point. What can we actually do here? And there's a huge long list in the report itself. I've just tried to summarize them in a few bullet points. In wild fisheries, we need to improve fisheries management. There are clear leaders in fisheries management that I can name. I'm happy to name names around the world that have taken strong steps towards improving fisheries management, and that has led to increases in fish catch, increases in livelihoods of fishermen around the world. So we need to adopt those kinds of approaches that improve fisheries management. And these include things like aligning incentives, for example, reducing or eliminating capacity enhancing subsidies. That's one approach, and there are lots of others in the report. Of course, we need to think hard about climate adaptation and mitigation. There's a lot to be said there. I'll leave it there, and we can discuss later if people are interested. What about on the mariculture side? Really, the main thing we need to be thinking about is policy opportunities to expand mariculture in a sustainable way. If I had to paint a broad picture, I would say that some countries have just not paid any attention to mariculture, have no regulations, and it's kind of gone crazy and really led to that backward bending supply curve, I would argue. Other countries have been too strict and said, well, boy, mariculture is bad. It causes a lot of pollution. Let's not allow it at all. And so you get almost no production in those countries. I think somewhere in the middle is the right way to go. We need to expand mariculture, but adhere to very strict sustainability requirements to ensure that we aren't compromising other ecosystem services in pursuit of this food objective. Lots more to say about action opportunities, but I think I'm out of time. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions now, and then we'll have more time for questions later on. So thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two questions. Yeah. Yeah. Or should I, Craig, do you want me to?
You just call them.
Okay. Okay. The farthest person from the mic.
Thank you for your presentation. Could you comment about whether whales and commercial whaling is included in your wild fisheries, and how for whales or any other species you address the ecosystem services they provide, such as being carbon sinks and carbon mitigation? Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. I agree. Whales play an really important role in the ecosystem, and they're not counted as food because they're a minute fraction of food today. There are, I guess, a couple of ways we indirectly account for them. So we're not thinking about using fisheries as a means of carbon mitigation, which is the kind of blue carbon idea that you're proposing. Other people have thought about that, and there are lots of good data on that. Actually, some recent papers that really make that case. So I can point you to those if you're interested. Our question was, can we increase food? Now, there may be an interaction with whales in an interesting way through food webs. So if we collapse fisheries, what are whales going to eat? There's issues like that. So maybe I'll just say that the sustainability requirements that we insisted on in building those supply curves in some way take account for the food web structure. And I can talk more about the details of that, maybe one-on-one if you like. And I think that would affect whales, but we're at least attempting to try to preserve food web structure as we sustainably increase food.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Stephen Lutz with Grid Arendal, based out of Norway. And actually, my question was sort of usurped by your question, because I was going to ask about the value of carbon for fisheries. And as you know, the IMF released a report on the value of carbon for whales. And I understand that model can be applied to fisheries as well. It's not exclusive to whales. So I'd just like to highlight that and say that this is potentially one of the next steps. Thank you.
Yeah, thinking of just one sentence, thinking about managing fisheries and other extraction in the ocean for carbon mitigation purposes, I think is a very interesting and promising approach. It just wasn't our charge with food from the sea, but excellent point. Okay, so I'm told to leave it there, and there'll be time for more questions later. So thank you very much.
More food from the sea. I'm sure that's got a lot of people thinking, you probably didn't walk in the room today thinking that that would be the answer, that bigger pie chart. I even noticed the width of the circle actually went up, right? So get your questions ready. There'll be an open session for Q&A coming a bit later on. But in the meantime, we're going to shift here to the second paper. This was on the expected impacts of climate change on the ocean economy. And for that, we have today one of the lead authors, Dr. Reniel Cabral, who is a research scientist on sustainable fisheries at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, again from UC Santa Barbara. So Ren, really excited to hear what you got to tell us. Welcome, Ren.
Okay, thanks, Craig. And thanks everyone for having me here. I'm very excited to present the results of our blue paper titled Impacts of Climate Change on the Ocean Economy. I'm Ren Cabral, and this is a blue paper that's been done by several co-authors from different countries. So the ocean contributes $2.5 trillion per year to the global economy and supports hundreds of millions of jobs. And 1/3 of the ocean economy comes from what we call the ecosystem-dependent industries, such as fisheries, mariculture, and tourism. And that my topic for today will be what will be the impacts of or expected impacts of climate change on the ocean economy, particularly on fisheries, mariculture, and coral reef tourism. There are several studies that have looked at the impacts of climate change at the global level. But what's new with this research is that we looked at the impacts of climate change at the country level, where policies are being implemented, or it's a more relevant scale. So we know that climate change have impacted already fisheries through reduction in or changes in the productivity of the fisheries, as well as climate change have shift or cause shifts from for several of the commercially important species. And that to be able to infer what will be the impact of climate change on fisheries, I want to walk you through this graph. X-axis is the percent difference in catch, y-axis is changes in profit, and where those two lines intersect is where we are today, which is we are catching 80 million metric tons of food valued at 130 billion US dollars per year. And under business as usual, which is our management will not change, and that the impacts of climate change will follow the climate projection of RCP 4.5. What will happen is that under business as usual, so you would imagine that productivity will decline in some countries, and a well-managed fishery in one country will move to a nation that's not prepared or don't have institution to manage those fisheries, and that there will be a collapse in the management of that fishery. What will happen is that in the future, or by the end of the century, we will experience a reduction of 20% in catch, as well as a reduction of 50% in profit. So that's huge. You can just imagine what will be the implication of that to food security. And that blue dot, that unlabeled blue dot, that is the situation where we reform our fisheries. That is, we implement a climate adaptive fisheries management reform. That is, we recover all our overfish fishery, as well as we make our fisheries management climate smart. And that by doing that, we could see that we could improve catch and profit relative to today, and more so relative to business as usual. So at increasing climate, or at increasing greenhouse gas emission, for example, RCP 6.0, we can still improve catch as well as profit relative to today. However, if the greenhouse gas emission is so high that it follows RCP 8.5, there is no way that we can improve catch and profit relative to today, although adaptation will still be much preferred compared to the business as usual. So I promise that we will present country level analysis, or the impacts of climate change on fisheries at the country level. And I will do that in the next slide. But I want you to point out with, so if we implement a climate adaptive fisheries management reform and get our acts together, or to lower the carbon greenhouse gas emission, and that would mean a global improvements in catch and profit relative to today. How would how would all the country benefit from that reform? The answer is the effects will be variable. So even under RCP 4.5, temperate as well as polar countries will benefit in the future or by the end of the century, but the tropical countries will have a reduction in catch and profit relative to today. So so even implementing a climate adaptive fishery reform will have of course global improvements in catch and profit, but that doesn't mean that everyone will be winners. Will be a winner of that one, and that's something that we should think about in the future. So as a solution, first is that we of course end overfishing, as well as implement a climate adaptive fisheries management reform. We have successes in that at the local scale and regional scale. It's a matter of scaling up those successes at a much faster rate. The second one is as stocks move from one nation to another, we are not yet very familiar with how we would manage those stocks that will shift, and that transboundary cooperation will be necessary. But that's something that we need to invest more on how to manage fisheries that are shifting, and implement a proper institution that will manage shifting stocks. And local adaptation is possible if we aggressively mitigate climate change. So mariculture, as Chris mentioned, is one of the fastest growing industry in the world, and it supports millions of jobs. And that even under climate change, several studies have shown that it will have high production potential in the future. And so to project the future of aquaculture, particularly the finfish fed mariculture, which is the top mariculture that we have today, and the demand is increasing. We implement a model that considers a business as usual scenario, which means that the fisheries management remains the same, so it will be impacted in the climate change by climate change in the future. 21 of the feed goes to mariculture. It means that the fish that we get, the forage fish that we get from the ocean, we distribute that to aquaculture as well as terrestrial agriculture, and 21% of that will go to mariculture. And there's and under business as usual, the conversion ratio of the fish we get from the ocean to aquaculture remains the same in the future. Then under RCP 8.5, what will happen is there's still huge potential for finfish mariculture from 8.88 million metric tons to about 6 million metric tons by the end of the century, which is still high, but of course lower than what we are getting today. But if we implement a progressive reform in mariculture, that is, we implement a climate adaptive fisheries management reform, which would mean that we would get more or available fish for feed or available feed ingredients from captured fisheries, and 75% of those feed goes to mariculture, and the rest goes to terrestrial agriculture. And there is continuous improvement in the conversion ratio from wild fish to mariculture. What will happen is that the finfish mariculture have huge potential by the end of the century. We will get greater than 100 million metric tons, which is huge. And what's good here is that every coastal countries in the world will benefit from a progressive mariculture reform. So there's huge potential for mariculture even under high climate change or high RCP scenarios. So a solution that we propose for mariculture will be, first is to manage our fisheries better by implementing climate adaptive fisheries reform, so that the availability of feed for mariculture from captured fisheries will increase. And we need to have advances in feed technology so that the conversion from wild captured fisheries to mariculture will be more efficient. And we need to breed more mariculture stock for fast growth that will boost production, as well as from a developing country perspective. That means that they can schedule their mariculture operations such that they would avoid storms and other ocean disturbances. And scientific investment for properly siting mariculture so that you can avoid some of the negative impacts of mariculture. So marine and coastal tourism is one of the top sectors or economies globally, and it's projected to be the #1 economy or sector by 2030 based on OECD. And it is valued at $390 billion per year and supports millions of jobs. And 10% of that comes from coral reef tourism. And I will focus on coral reef tourism, where small islands, developing states, as well as the developing countries in the tropics are highly dependent. Some countries such as Maldives and Palau, over 40% of their gross domestic products are from coral reefs, and that you can imagine the implication of declining coral reefs in the future to these economies. So how do we model impacts of climate change? So we consider warming would induce more bleaching events in the future. Ocean acidification will affect the calcification rates and growth of coral, and therefore there will be more mortality in the future under increasing global warming. And that we also consider the potential adaptation of coral reefs or corals to warming. That is, corals themselves can adapt to climate change. So we tested that. So suppose that there is no adaptation of corals, meaning they can't adapt to warming, what will happen in the future? So this is a percent change of reef tourism values. So the value from coral reef in 2100 relative to today, and it's all gone even under RCP 4.5. And these results are consistent with several studies, as well as the IPCC report SR, or Special Report 1.5, and the current report on the ocean and the cryosphere in the changing climate. There's very high confidence that even if we limit global warming by 1.5 degrees relative to the pre-industrial time, we would it will be coral reefs will still experience very high risk from global warming. So suppose, but of course we know that the corals and other organisms can sometimes adapt to changing climate, and we impose a 1 degree Celsius per century adaptation of coral reefs, and it's a bit better. There's no hope for RCP 8.5, but as you decrease the warming or the emission scenarios, some of the corals will still be there, but generally it will be the coral reefs and the coral reef industry, tourism and the industry will be heavily affected in the future. So first and foremost, we need to be aggressive in mitigating or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so that all the adaptation options at the local level will have huge effect. And some of the solutions that we recommend would be ecosystem protection and threat reduction, so that we will not exacerbate, or we will not exacerbate the impacts of climate change, and that so we can maintain coral reef values now and the near future. Future-oriented planning of tourism developments, meaning putting tourism development sites in areas that are less exposed to ocean disturbances, and diversifying portfolios of tourism, those that are less dependent on coral reefs, so that communities will be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So we know, or I've shown, that climate change will have huge impacts on fisheries, especially in the developing tropics or tropical areas. We know that climate change will have negative impacts on tourism, and that's also in the tropical areas. But there's huge potential for mariculture in the future, and we want to analyze whether improvements in mariculture can we offset the negative impacts of climate change to fisheries and tourism by improving mariculture. So that will be our question in the next few slides. So for food, the source of food will be mariculture and wild capture fisheries. Under business as usual, there are net winners. There are countries that will still benefit from or improve their catch and or their food production in the future, even under climate change. But there are lots of countries that are net losers. Net offsetters means a reduction in one sector will be compensated by improvements in another sector. But if we implement a progressive reform that includes the improvement in managing fisheries, as well as improvements in technologies for mariculture production, that you could see that there are many countries that will benefit from a progressive reform. In terms of profits, we know that tourism will have negative impacts on several countries, but improving or implementing an adaptive or a progressive reform in mariculture can actually offset many of the negative impacts of climate change in the future. So growth in ocean ecosystem economy is possible, but a prerequisite for that is that we need to mitigate climate change aggressively. And we know that sectors and opportunities will shift in the future. So programs are needed to be able to facilitate these livelihood transitions. Thank you. I can now accept 2 questions. Now it's on.
Thanks. I'm John Stern from the World Bank. It's a very interesting issue we're talking about, but I didn't get a very good sense of what are the mechanisms by which climate change affects productivity here. And I presume some of the main ones are acidification and temperature change, but the latter probably could go in both directions. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I can discuss it to you later as well, the details. So under warming, some of the capture fisheries or those fisheries in the ocean, they have preferred temperature, and that will affect their production or their maximum sustainable yield, or the amount of fish that you can harvest from the ocean. So physiologically, that increases in temperature will impede growth in some of the fishes, while it will promote growth in other species. So if the polar areas will get warmer, some species will like that, and therefore they can grow. Some others don't like that, and therefore their production will be lower. For bivalve species, so they form their shells, that will be affected by acidification. So we consider here the aragonite saturation, and aragonite saturation state is more of a how calcification rate will be affected in the future. So in the future, under if aragonite saturation will be lower, that will mean that the corals as well as some of the bivalve species will have difficulty in forming their shells, and therefore that will affect their growth, and might induce mortality as well. What I think an important aspect here is that we haven't considered other stressors such as pollution, diseases that might get frequent in the future given climate change, and the storms in the tropical countries. It will get more severe in the future, and that will have consequences on both fisheries as well as the coral reefs, and those are not accounted for, and might be our projection might be conservative. So yeah, so there are several elements there that we carefully accounted for to be able to make our prediction as solid as possible. Yes.
Hi, I'm Miriam Goldstein, Center for American Progress. It seems like they're in these sort of looking at these trade-offs, for example, between the coral reef unfortunate demise and the fisheries trade-offs in terms of mariculture. We're seeing some pretty significant cultural changes. Are the underlying assumptions for mariculture, is it that world preference would still be for fish that would rely on wild source feed, or given that we're undergoing a lot of cultural changes from say a coral reef dependent community to a mariculture community, can you assume also that there might be some dietary shifts perhaps towards eating forage fish directly or unfed aquaculture?
That's a wonderful question. So the conversion rate from wild fisheries to aquaculture currently for many species, it's actually less than 1. You need much less fish from the wild to convert it to a edible biomass of mariculture, because you source the other source of nutrients for fish from other ingredients such as soy and corn and so on. So in the future, and Chris mentioned that Norway is one of the leader of this, more of a getting all other nutrition from other sources, not from wild capture fisheries. That will definitely improve mariculture production. You touched on one point on cultural shifts within a local level. So the stakeholders will be different. Some of the communities that are highly dependent on coral reefs, when you recommend that they will shift into mariculture, that might be a different set of stakeholders, and that you need to take into account how to facilitate that shift, or those will be like the affected communities from coral reefs to mariculture. How would you facilitate that in terms of dietary shift? I think there's still, of course, a prerequisite to mariculture is that wild capture fisheries will be managed well. That's not really a prerequisite, but more of it will improve the supply of fish from wild capture to mariculture, and that there's still a supply of wild fisheries for a certain community, but more and more people would under like increasing demand for fish, more and more people will have their preference, or they will eat more aquaculture food, and we are seeing that many people are eating aquaculture food. It's first many of the species are very good for climate change. They don't require lots of resources, and they don't emit carbon dioxide that much. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And you'll get a chance to ask more questions after our panel session here. I'll be calling the two speakers up, but in the meantime, first, we're gonna have a chance to hear from perspectives from a few additional experts and kind of reflections on what they just heard. So as I call your name, please come up and take a seat here in one of these four middle seats here. Loretta Burke, Senior Associate at WRI and lead author of the Reefs at Risk series that we've published over the years. Emily Owen, Manager of Coastal Wetlands and Coral Reefs at the Pew Charitable Trust. Eric Schwab, Senior Vice President of the Ocean Program at the Environmental Defense Fund. And Mark J. Spalding, President of the Ocean Foundation. Please come on up and join us. Give a round of applause for our panelists. So here we go. So we've heard we've heard a lot about the potential here and a little bit about the policies. I'm going to jump a little bit into the policies here. I kind of came to the end of the presentations because there's a lot assumed there about what needs to happen to actually achieve these potentials here. And Emily, I'd like to maybe start with you about, what do you see based on what you've heard in terms of the types of policy and governance changes that are required to actually promote more sustainable food from the sea?
There we go. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Craig. And thank you, ambassadors and Ren and Chris for presenting. Clearly, we've both heard from the reports that we need to strike a balance between improved management and then, as Ren mentioned at the end, also thinking about protections. So different policy mechanisms and governance that we can look at is first in terms of protections. We need to strive to protect at least 30% of our oceans by 2030 in order to help support a thriving ocean and the future of the ocean economy. And there's one important mechanism, as a way to do this, is to look at a high seas treaty that can protect areas beyond national jurisdiction. And another thing that came up in terms of improved management that Chris touched on was in the report mentioned illegal fisheries. And so 1 in 5 fish is caught illegally today. So if we're going to help curb this overfishing crisis, we also have to look at how fish can be caught in a legal and sustainable manner. So one of the things that Pew is working on is using new technology to improve monitoring, working with countries to strengthen their enforcement mechanisms, and also encouraging countries to sign on to important international treaties such as the Port State Measures Agreement and the Cape Town Agreement. Another thing that Chris mentioned briefly was fisheries subsidies. And also I'd like to thank the ambassador from Mexico for sharing ambitions to look at both protections of coastal ecosystems, reducing fisheries subsidies, and also tackling the illegal fishing problem. When we're talking about reducing fisheries subsidies, this is one of the main drivers of overfishing today. And as the blue paper points out that Chris authored, these harmful fisheries subsidies actually drive fishers to fish harder, longer, and further from port. And one of the key opportunities there is today to make a difference in policy and governance on an international level is for governments to come together at the WTO this June and put an end to these harmful fisheries subsidies.
Great. Eric, thoughts on the same question?
Well, I think part of the good news is that we are seeing this happen in a lot of places. At EDF, we work very aggressively, both in the US and around the world, on fisheries reform to realize the kinds of opportunities that Chris spoke to, but also to prepare for the kinds of impacts that Ren spoke about. I was fortunate to have been at NOAA during the implementation of the US reforms that were set in motion under the 2006 reauthorization of the Magnuson Act. And we've seen effective fisheries management yield the kind of results that, that Chris spoke to as possible under reform of wild stock fisheries. We have also seen more recently, reforms of the common fisheries policy in the EU, just a little over a year ago, reform of the national fisheries policy in Japan, and we've seen reforms in Cuba and Belize, all of those just in recent years. And so to be able to bring forth the kinds of reformed management that is referenced in the Food from the Sea paper to yield the kinds of tangible results under sort of a static climate environment is showing results. We're seeing more fish in the water, we're seeing improved harvests, and we're seeing improved business conditions for fishermen in the places where these reforms are being executed. The flip side of that is there are a lot of places where that work is still very much underway. Some of the basic building blocks of science-based management, quota-based management, and addressing a lot of the problems that Emily just referred to are still very much underway, but those things are very much possible. And one of the fundamental fundamental principles of preparing for the climate change, addressing climate change that is underway, preparing for what's to come in the future is that basic sort of set of management, those basic sort of fishery management building blocks that we're seeing working in places around the world.
Great. Emily, you kind of scared me there for a second. 1 in 5 fish is kind of legally. So if I buy MSC certified fish, am I good?
Well, ideally, we should be striving for market.
It's simple, yes.
Well, I mean, I would say we could go further and we could actually look at how markets and consumer preferences can drive looking for specifically stamped, legally caught fish.
Okay, good. Mark, I'm going to turn to you next here. A different question here. Both papers talked a lot about mariculture. We've heard a lot about it today. I'm curious, from your perspective, what changes need to be done to mariculture, practice-wise, policy-wise, to ensure that this, both papers place a big bet on mariculture to ensure that actually is sustainable?
So I think we need to think about what will make it succeed in increasing production quantity, right? I mean, that's the goal here. And so it is creating the environment for success, which means, Ren, we do need to think about the pollution and other changes that we're seeing in the system as we see microplastics in mariculture species in the ocean. We have to take that into consideration. We have to make sure that blue carbon systems are fully restored so that the water quality that they provide, the habitat they provide, and the potential for mitigation of ocean acidification for mariculture that is adjacent to them happens, right? So we need to create all of these systems of management, just like we're talking about wild fisheries management. We need to talk about the management of putting too much bad stuff into the ocean, ensuring that the ecosystem is there to support mariculture, and that things like plastic aren't getting into the ocean in the first place.
And any policy reforms on mariculture per se?
Well, as was mentioned, we have a few countries where we have no policy and a huge expansion of mariculture, a few countries with no policy and no expansion. So the bottom line here is we need political will. We need the thought process of what kind of aquaculture is sustainable, where it can be placed, all of that sort of thing. We've got some information on our website that talks about the different types of aquaculture, which ones are more sustainable than others. As was in a couple of the slides, you analyze the inputs, the fuel use, the distance you have to go, et cetera, to think about the sustainability of each one of these. And so that's got to be part of how we think about designing policy around mariculture, as well as the policies that may not have the word mariculture on them that create the environment for success for increased abundance from mariculture.
Great. Loretta, in Ren's presentation, you saw those maps. There's a lot of red in those maps, and especially when it came to the coral reefs, your area of expertise. What do we do about this, right? What can be done? How does one mitigate or adapt, given this tourism industry that 10% of it depends upon coral reefs? Your thoughts?
I think there are two big areas that where we can act. One is economic valuation, and another is reducing local threats. And on economic valuation, I think the study you've just released is excellent, but it's at a level where you do a lot of raising awareness about the threats, and maybe you encourage global action and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But for local action in communities and small island nations, I think you need much more localized economic valuations. And just a little plug for some past WRI work. We had a coastal capital project series focused on the Caribbean, which developed a standardized method for valuation of coral reef associated tourism, fisheries, and shoreline protection services. And it's been implemented in about 10 places around the region. But we went on to look at about 100 economic valuation studies that had been done in the Caribbean and the policy influence that these studies have had. And it was the minority by a long shot that had policy influence. And we teased out the enabling conditions that actually caused policy uptake. And they were local demand for the valuation study, that it wasn't just written and dropped in on them. Engagement with the stakeholders, such that they were a part of the study and were really understanding the results. Good access to decision makers, of course, high dependence on the coastal ecosystem, and low corruption in the country, so that the results might actually be used rather than ignored. And the other thing I mentioned is reducing local threats. And we know a lot about this. It's been said so many times, we need to reduce overfishing pressure and pollution and physical impacts on reefs. And in some areas, tourism pressure, where we're loving coral reefs to death. And we can do some of these things. We haven't done a good job, and we can use marine spatial planning as a tool to reduce threats and guard areas of high larval production, so they can seed other reefs for recovery. But I think there's an area that really gets too little attention, given the importance of this threat. And it's a single word, and it's not plastics, as was in the graduate many years ago. It's sewage. We know so little about how much is coming from where. Particularly in developing countries, there's inadequate sewage treatment. And often in tourist resorts, they have these little packaged treatment plants, and they're obligatory at the time of the resort creation, but then there's inadequate maintenance. So they're discharging human waste on the reefs, and between the nutrient pollution and the bacteria and pathogens, it's bad for the reefs, increasing the risk of bleaching and ocean acidification impacts and coral disease. So, and it's not good for tourists either. Tourists don't like polluted waters.
How many in the room actually understood Loretta's reference to The Graduate? Just raise your hand. All right. We're still in the game. We're still in the game. All right. That's a dig at you, Generation Zs out there. In light of everything, this is for all of you here, in light of everything you've heard thus far today, you know, again, I was saying there's a lot of red, right, on that. So I'm looking for some images here of hope, right? Tell us, you all have been engaged in this for years. You know, what's a story of hope, an example from somewhere that says, you know what, we can get there, whether it's on issues of food from the sea or mitigating the impact of climate change on some of these ocean industries? Give us a story of hope. Who wants to go first? Who feels hopeful right now? Mark's feeling hopeful.
So we talked about the fact that Chris mentioned we could name various places where fisheries reform works and recovery happens. And Eric said the same kind of thing. And part of this, in my view, is the triumph of the commons as opposed to the tragedy of the commons. So more of an Elinor Ostrom approach. And let me give you what I think is probably the most successful fisheries example. And Susan and Stephen mentioned this earlier, right? We had a fishery that got tremendously overfished, and we agreed as a globe to stop fishing and allow its biomass to recover. And it has been wildly successful. We have more whales now in many different species in every different parts of the world as a result of our agreement to stop commercial whaling and to allow the biomass to recover. And stick with me, this is a fisheries agreement, right? The moratorium was put in place so we could negotiate how we were going to continue managing the fishery when it resumed, right? And so I think it's a tremendous example of the global effort. We're seeing this now, and Emily mentioned the high seas treaty that's being negotiated. I think there are examples of international cooperation among governments in high seas fisheries, I think on whales, I think on climate, all of which are going to give us reason to move in the right direction on these issues, whether it be the tourism issue or the fisheries issue. And I think that one example is the one that I hold up all the time.
Loretta.
I have two reasons for optimism right now. I took about a 4-year break from working on coral reefs, and I was more focused on climate adaptation. But returning to the coral reef area, there are two things that have really struck me. One is the way different groups are collaborating currently, like really working together and building on each other's work in a very positive way. You know, institutional hats off, and let's do this for the reefs. Also, I started going to some scientific meetings again in Europe. And when I was working on coral reefs before, a lot of it was about doom and gloom and the prediction, well, a lot of red on maps. Yes, we still see a lot of red on maps. But hearing what scientists were saying about what's going on in research on assisted adaptation to warming seas, and also results from the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network on current trends, they were telling stories that really surprised me and maybe still have to be verified, but that many regions are not having the sort of declines that we expected by now. And in some areas, reefs are showing signs of recovery. So I'm optimistic because of the way our community is working together and because of what the reefs themselves are managing to do.
Great, great. I feel uplifted already. Emily.
All right. Well, I have reason to have hope because looking at what both governments and communities are doing today based on ocean protection. Looking at COP25, there are many larger discussions about the success of that event. However, if we look at coastal wetlands in particular and nature-based solutions as a complement to the aggressive mitigation measures that we need, as Ren mentioned, they showed an emergence that I hadn't seen before. And it was really exciting to hear countries like Seychelles and Belize commit to include mangroves and seagrasses in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And so the co-benefits of these ecosystems are becoming more broadly recognized. We know that they are important spawning grounds for commercially important species. They provide ecosystem services like water filtration, and they also buffer shorelines from severe storms that we're going to keep seeing more and more with a changing climate. In fact, it was really interesting to see that the presence of mangroves, recent studies have shown, have actually been able to help the local community economies be more resilient as they're hit by these hard hurricanes. So basically, if you've got mangroves, your economy won't be hit as hard when that devastating storm does come through. So we see these countries and they're looking to incorporate these coastal wetlands into their NDCs. For example, Seychelles has looked at an ambitious program. They're already protecting 30% of their waters, but now they're looking at, okay, well, what's in it? They're doing the marine spatial planning process, and they're going to look at and map all of the seagrass beds that they have in their exclusive economic zone. So that on the side of government gives me hope. In terms of communities, you know, you see things like the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island. They've set aside 720,000 square kilometers. That's the size of France, of the ocean, for both protection of the marine biodiversity, but also of their traditional fishing and cultural customs. So you see these new types of MPAs emerging that makes me very hopeful to think that together on different scales, different types of people and for different motivations, we can come together for a better, healthier ocean and planet.
Great, great, Emily. You figured it out. You're next.
So I already gave you a big part of my hopeful answer around fisheries reform and some of the real progress we're seeing there. But, I would really talk about 3 levels. And the first level starts with, I think, the work that is represented here today. I mean, the excellent leadership that's being exhibited by the high-level panel ambassadors, as well as these papers. And if you've only looked at these summary papers, you're missing some great work, because the depth, the comprehension, the currency of what is presented in just these 2 papers alone is incredible. And I would urge you to take advantage of that. And I think that that sort of global thought leadership is incredibly important. We're seeing action not only in fisheries reform, but in sort of anticipating climate changes at regional and national levels. We're involved, as are others, in the Humboldt Current region of Chile, Peru, and Ecuador, where the countries down there are not only working on these basic building blocks of fisheries reform, but they are already putting into place early warning systems to anticipate changes in ocean temperatures, in ocean currents, in the other factors that are going to lead to some of the movements that Ren described, so that they can anticipate and adjust management accordingly. And then go down to the local level. One of the things that's represented in the Food for the Sea from the Sea paper is the fact that a lot of the really positive reforms in fisheries management have happened sort of in kind of first world places in the large industrial fisheries. And there are a lot of small scale fisheries on which billions of people around the world depend for nutrition that are as yet unassessed and sort of fully not unaddressed from a management reform perspective. And yet we, along with others, are sponsoring work with small scale fisheries capacity building. I was at a learning network experience in the Asia Pacific region in Tokyo, where we had representatives from the Philippines, from Myanmar, from China, Japan, from Indonesia, working together to talk about the kinds of tools that they can apply to do rapid assessment of stocks, to do to kind of substitute for the sort of full-scale management reforms that we put in place in places like the US and the EU. And those kinds of things can work and are working, and the excitement from the global scale to national scale all the way down to local action is real cause for optimism.
Great, great, great. Let's give it a round of applause for our panelists here. Stay. You're going to stay because I'm going to invite up Chris and Ren. Go take the 2 extra seats here. I'm going to open the floor now for Q&A. This is your chance. And Craig's rules are, I'll point you out, give me your name and the organization you work for, and then ask a question. No speech, make sure it's a question. 20 seconds or less. I'm going to try to do 3 at a time. I've got 2 runners here. And so we're ready to go. I see a hand here, and hand here. I'll get to the rest right here we go.
Hello, my name is Alicia Cade. I work for Oceana as senior counsel there. Chris, in your talk, you did mention you were going to tell us a little bit more about those shining examples of fisheries management, and I'd love to hear them. Okay, Maria Hatziolas, formerly with the World Bank, retired but still very engaged. I wanted to touch on the theme of innovation and also the policies with respect to subsidies. It strikes me that one possible innovative policy intervention would be to shift some of the destructive subsidies which have generated overexploitation, overfishing, to ecosystem restoration. I'm particularly interested in the focus on mangroves and seagrasses because of their really very high degree of value in terms of productivity, in terms of carbon capture and resilience, and also their benefits to coral reef ecosystems, which could benefit not only tourism, but also fisheries. So I'm wondering if one could see a transfer of subsidies from fishing to restoration and thereby basically inject some much needed capital into those coastal communities until such time as the productivity can increase.
So it is green. I don't have to press anything. Thanks very much. Gerald Miles from EDF. And my question's to Chris, and it was just to clarify the growth in food from current to future. It looked like in the percentages there wasn't a significant growth in wild caught fisheries. It was about maintaining that number. So it was just to sort of clarify what the actual tonnage is in wild caught and what is important really to maintain that level. Thanks.
Great. All right. Have at it.
Can I take a crack? And I'm sure others would want to weigh in, and I'd rather listen to them than myself. I'll make this quick. I'll just quickly touch on all three if I can, very, very quickly. Shining examples. I mean, many were mentioned. I agree with everything that was said. I want to mention one more that wasn't mentioned, because if you look at all those maps, Mexico's always red for everything. And I feel badly about that. I work in Mexico, and I want to speak to the ambassador and say that there are some extremely good examples, going back to Eric's point, of small scale fisheries innovations in Mexico that are working and should be replicated around the world. These are concession-based approaches, turf-based approaches, small-scale spatial management of fisheries where local communities have exclusive access and manage the whole ecosystem. So I'll leave it at that. I have lots of details, but I think Mexico's done a great job on that, and I think others should follow their lead. But then, of course, there are many other examples that were already mentioned. Can we repurpose subsidies that are currently fueling overfishing of the high seas and elsewhere in the world, and repurpose them towards ecosystem restoration? Absolutely. This is in the purview of individual countries. It's individual countries that are subsidizing their fishing fleets, not somebody else. It's individual countries. They're doing that for good reason. They want to support the livelihoods of some of the most needy people in their country. You can still do that by having them use those resources for restoration or other things that would benefit the productivity of the ocean. I think the mechanisms for doing that are not well worked out, but yes, there's a lot of potential there. The last question about growth in wild fisheries, we do project a growth that wild fisheries could expand catch, but you can't just go and start fishing harder. The way you expand catch is you fish less in the short run to rebuild those stocks, and as the stocks rebuild, you'll be able to catch more and still keep the stocks in the ocean higher.
Just to jump on one piece of this and shifting the subsidies, absolutely. And part of the reason for shifting the subsidies is subsidizing the fisheries is arguably illegal. Subsidizing marine protected areas and restoration of blue carbon is legal. So why not do it? The work that Oceana did at the World Trade Organization to try and question fisheries subsidies almost got to the finish line. I think we are still at a tipping point where we're going to declare certain kinds of these subsidies absolutely illegal under the international trade regime, and therefore that money is freed up. And there's a absolutely and completely legal way to spend it that will also increase productivity of fisheries, also create jobs, also create food security. So let's do it.
So just one more quick thought on subsidies, because as Chris mentioned, one of the challenges of reforming fisheries is in the short term, you're constraining catch to get to that better place in the future, both for the fishermen and for the oceans. And I think a big opportunity for redirection of subsidies is in helping the fishermen through that transition. And that might be not exactly yielding the immediate blue carbon or habitat benefits, but it is definitely a pathway forward to fisheries reform.
Well, just to agree with everyone else that it's a wonderful idea and a mechanism that is achievable. And certainly for me, those coastal habitats would be one of the top priorities for restoration and protection. As you mentioned, great co-benefits as well as the mitigation value. Mangroves, for example, they store carbon 3 to 5 times more carbon per acre actually than tropical rainforests. So if countries are looking for a way to use their budgets effectively, generate both mitigation and adaptation co-benefits, then coastal wetlands are one of the best places they can look.
A few more questions. I saw some hands over here. Oh, wow. Right here in the second row. Right here in the second row.
Thank you for excellent presentations and panel. Now, I'm Thelma Philip Brown, and I'm from the category you didn't mention. I eat seafood, I vacation by the sea, and I also was born and raised on the sea. I'm from St. Kitts and Nevis. And so I'm very interested in a lot I could say, but I'm just going to limit it to two. I was interested in the fact that you raised the second paper, saying that even if we do what we need to do, the temperate climates would not benefit. That struck me, and I want, in terms of the wild caught food, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that more. I noticed you mentioned that mariculture, it would improve. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. The second point I wanted to raise, recently in the Caribbean, there were pictures circulating of fish, thousands, coming to the surface in Guadeloupe, literally bursting nets. And so there's a fear in the Caribbean, but couple that with the increased seismic activity in Puerto Rico and some of the other islands. There's fear that something is going on in the Caribbean Sea, and there's fear that maybe drilling for natural gas and oil is the issue. I want to know if this could be affecting or could affect food production in the Caribbean.
Great, thank you. Another question. Just, I think you're being humble too. You're also the ambassador.
Yes,
St. Kitts and Nevis.
Hi, I'm Celeste Smith from the National Science Foundation. My question is, how can we ensure that the prescription of sustainability practices are fair to the under-resourced or underprivileged? Thank you.
One final question over here. There was a hand, gentleman with the glasses standing up. We'll do a quick round of responses, then we need to go to our.
Bill Klein from Economics International and the Peterson Institute. Overall, this is encouraging, but the base numbers do place some constraint on how much the ocean can save us from the ravages of global warming. If you have something like a notional 15% reduction in agricultural production by the end of the century as a consequence of the less precipitation in the drought areas, et cetera. I mean, by the time you get to the fact that the real hope in oceans is on something that's only 20% of the base of, and the base is only 1/6 of the total animal. I think what it does suggest is that the challenges are great, and we probably shouldn't count a lot on being able to offset the damages in agriculture from new opportunities in the oceans.
Any quick reflections on, not everyone has to answer every single question. Anyone with responses to the three? Go ahead.
So just on Celeste, I think, you know, very few people have talked about the blue economy and the changes in the ocean economy that would say align with a Green New Deal, thinking about the just transition as certain kinds of ocean economy jobs and sectors have to be ramped down and replaced with something else. And you know, there's not always a direct transition, right? The person who is a high seas fisheries boat captain is not going to turn around and be planting mangroves. And so you have to figure out, if you say we're not going to do that luxury fish on the high seas for the wealthiest countries, and those jobs go away, how do we do something to transition? If we take away the subsidies, how do we do something about the transition and then shift money to some other investments? And I think we need to have those conversations. So thanks for that question.
I was just going to quickly point out that both the ambassador and Celeste really hit on a couple of the other key principles of climate resilient fisheries management in the future. And one of those is that in these temperate zones, while the productivity might be relatively flat, you're going to have stocks shift in and out. And so there's a huge potential for either current management structures to fail or increasing conflict as stock shifts across political boundaries. And we really have to have management systems that are thinking about ahead those challenges. And then one of the other key principles is that equity question. And I think is it in Ren, your paper that talks about, you know, the relative impact, for example, of wild stock fisheries from a productivity perspective, but it represents like almost 50% of ocean-based jobs. Is that right? Yeah. And it's fascinating because it emphasizes the dependence of local people in a lot of remote places on nutrition from the sea, and factoring those equity considerations into future planning is going to be incredibly important.
One more comment on sustainability and equity with regard to tourism. Even in the current circumstances, tourism doesn't necessarily benefit the local economy or local people all that much. There are often tremendous leakages of the spending in a country is going to, foreign-owned hotels, and the workers can't necessarily even live near their workplace just because of the way zoning is done or the way the resort is built. And are there solutions to that to improve it? One is just people voting with their pocketbook to support more sustainably managed tourism destinations.
Yes, just briefly to add on that, as we're looking for equity and parity across the globe, really, we need to find global, regional, and local solutions. And one of the ways that those local solutions can be targeted is by looking at the science, but also strongly considering the local knowledge and the traditional customs of each area so that they can be incorporated into any protection and management schemes.
Great. I have actually an intervention here by one of the ambassadors. The ambassador from Portugal wants to have a comment about the subsidies.
Thank you very much, Craig. It's just on the subsidies question. There is an ongoing cooperation process involving the European Union, the United States, and Japan on reviewing the WTO mechanism, decision mechanisms, areas to be covered, things like that. Well, it's, as you might imagine, a very complex, very tricky, very difficult cooperation mechanism. But at the same time, it's showing some results. And one of them was the agreement that was signed yesterday covering exactly subsidies. And so it's between the European Union, the United States, and Japan. And the agreement covers not only the areas that are to be covered in the review of decision-making mechanisms and rules, but also on the launching of a reach-out procedure. So I would say that any comments coming from the civil society, from you, from everybody in this room on how do you see subsidies could be extremely helpful at this stage and extremely timely. So that was.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know we have more questions. Go ahead and take your seats. There's more questions. They'll be around afterwards. I'm trying to just make sure we stay on time here. So they'll be around. Feel free to come and ask questions. I'm sorry we can get to every single question. To round things out, I'm pleased to have another ambassador here, Ambassador Cora Oz, the Norwegian ambassador to the United States. Norway is an ocean nation and has a lot of experience with this. So let's give a round of applause for the ambassador.
Thank you, Craig. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are not too tired and that you bear with me now for 10 minutes. I'm happy really to be here, and it's an honor to be here with so many ocean friends. And it's also great to see so many familiar faces. And I think that it's been a very, very good morning, and I have learned a lot. Thank you to Dr. Costello and Dr. Cabral for your presentations and the panel members for your insightful discussion. The value of listening to experts like yourself cannot be underestimated. I also like to thank World Resources Institute for once again organizing such a wonderful event and for your close cooperation with Norway. I want you to know, Craig and the rest of the team at the WRI, that we consider you as our best buddy. And also a thank to the embassies of Portugal, Mexico, and Jamaica for co-hosting today's event. Events like these are so important. At my embassy, we strive to bring the ocean agenda out, not just here in Washington, D.C., but across the country. I recently traveled to Maine, Washington State, and Rhode Island to discuss ocean issues. And in March, I'm going to Alaska. Norway is both an Arctic and an ocean nation. And the issues discussed today, food from the sea and climate change's impact on the ocean economy, are extremely important to my country. These are two highly interrelated issues. They represent areas of concern, but indeed also opportunities. And if we are able to increase production and consumption of food from the sea, then we will be able to solve many of the global challenges we are facing, as we heard today, including extreme poverty, hunger, and climate change. So the ocean has the potential to achieve many of the sustainable development goals. My boss, the Norwegian Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, sincerely hopes that when the high-level panel presents their recommendations at the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, and Ambassador, I'm sure it will be a success this summer, that the conference will spur political action that helps keep our oceans both healthy and wealthy. A critical issue the international community and our leaders have to solve is how to maintain food security, nutrition, and economic sustainability while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I have learned from the Blue Paper 1 that fish, which provides only 20%, and the professor uses 16%. I see in the paper it's 20%. I'm not sure it's between 20 and 16 of the animal protein consumption by humans is uniquely positioned to play an important role. Let me then say something about Norway's experience as the world's second largest exporter of seafood and the largest producer of farmed salmon. Last year, Norway exported 36 million seafood meals every day. In only 8 years, Norway's seafood exports have doubled. This is obviously good for the Norwegian economy, but it also contributes to global needs for more food from the sea. And we are looking for ways to increase our exports even further, and other ocean nations should do the same, including the United States. The story of how Norway got where we are today is long and windy, and the result of trial and error. It involves political decision-making in many of the areas discussed here today in the two blue papers: overfishing, illegal fishing, climate change, and sustainability. In Norway, we manage our living marine resources through an ecosystem-based approach. This means we regulate industries based on science and what the ecosystems can support. Our fishing industry has a long tradition where science, knowledge, and management work hand in hand. Stakeholders from local coastal communities, civil society, government, scientists, and the fishers themselves are all included throughout the regulatory process. I think that's a very, very good model. 70% of the value of Norway's total seafood exports come from aquaculture. The Norwegian companies in this sector are consistently ranked among the most sustainable protein producers in the world. Some of them are even moving their production on land. Norwegian technology for land-based fish farms is currently in use or in process in Maine, Florida, and California. However, sustainability in Norway didn't just happen on its own. Until the 1970s, some decades ago, fishing in Norway was nearly without regulations. The near depletion of our herring stock led to the world's first fishing quota in the early 70s. This saved the herring, and today, listen to this, it represents our largest wild catch export by volume. Just to repeat, this would never have been the case without political will to regulate in close cooperation with the stakeholders. As we all know, we have heard that fish see no borders. Fish stocks migrate between one country's waters to another's. Management of fish stocks requires strong international cooperation. And I would like to give you one example from Norway. And it stands out as a close and successful cooperation between the Russian Federation and Norway in the Barents Sea on management of the shared cod stock. Today, the cod stock, which migrates between Norwegian and Russian waters, is the world's largest and most valuable. This has become a national treasure chest for both Norway and Russia. It's also a fact that Norway takes its international commitments very, very seriously. And I would like just to mention one program we have, and it's called Overfish for Development program, which provides capacity building to partner countries in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And it promotes ocean health as a path to economic growth. This is a successful story, and I would very much encourage you to look into it. Let me also use my final minutes to speak about Norway as an Arctic country. Most of our ocean areas, 70%, are in the Arctic, and nearly 10% of the Norwegian population lives in the Arctic, the highest percentage of any country. Meanwhile, as we have heard today, Arctic temperatures are increasing at 2 times the average global rate. And blue paper number 2 shows that the impact of climate change is far more severe on other ocean-based economies than on Norway's. And as we learned from the paper, some West African, we saw that on the slide also, some West African countries could see fish stocks decline by as much as 85%. And as I see that, that's a potential nightmare. Even though Norway doesn't face the potential risk as in West Africa, Norway is nevertheless experiencing the effects in other areas. We encounter more extreme weather in the form of heavy rain and flooding. We are also deeply disturbed over the devastating wildfires in Australia and California, the rapid melting of the ice cap of Greenland, and the flooding and drought in the United States. As the blue paper presented by Dr. Cabral explains, the most effective way to limit the impact of climate change on the oceans is to reduce global CO2 emissions. We know the Paris Agreement, we all know that is important for the oceans as well as other ecosystems. And we continue, and we have been very vocal on that for a long time. Norway regrets the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. World leaders will meet in Glasgow later this year to enhance their Paris climate targets. The importance of international leadership is indeed crucial. So let there be no doubt, Norway will continue to be a reliable and consistent partner in their international efforts to promote sustainable use of the ocean, to ensure that we have a clean and healthy ocean, and to support the blue economy in developing countries. And as a final note, I would like to tell you that Norway is competing for a seat on the Security Council for the years 2021 and 2022. I won't tell you who we are competing against, but there are 2 nice countries. But I would like all of you to go out there in the streets and where you come from and say that vote for Norway, because that will be a strong voice on the oceans and the climate change. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Just think, if your ancestors 1,000 years ago stuck around, we'd all be speaking Norwegian right now. So wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you all. First, I want to thank the government of Norway and the Global Environment Facility for its support of the high-level panel process. Also want to thank today the embassies of Jamaica, Mexico, Portugal, and Norway for co-hosting this event. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you all for all the great stuff you do. I recognize a lot of the faces in the room, right? This is part of the community. Hope you feel energized. I really liked the visions of hope that we heard around the table here. So I hope we actually all go out here a bit more energized, a little bit more kick in our step, that we can actually make a difference here on the ocean. Because, you know, just remember, right? The ocean is too big to fail, right? It's not too big to fix, and it's not too late to act. So with that, let's all go forward. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was good. That was good.